When amateur scientist Thomas first found this long-lost treasure, he could not believe his eyes. This could be the discovery of the century. This could make him the famous scientist he always wanted to be. His colleagues warned him about the finding, and after seeing what was inside it, they thought it was haunted. But Thomas didn't listen. Thomas would be haunted for the rest of his life by the moment he pulled that thing out of the water. Before we start our story, smash the like button. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes when he saw that the missing airplane was real. Everybody thought it was just a children's story, but Thomas would shock the world with this evidence. With all his strength, he tried to break the window, but it was almost impossible to break it underwater. If Thomas wants to know for sure if the stories are real, he needs to find another way to get in. He has to prove it to the world. This could change everything. Thomas swam around the sunken airplane in search of another entrance, but there was no other way to get inside. He wasted a lot of time swimming around, and his air tank was about to run dry, so Thomas had no other choice but to swim back to the surface and rethink his plan. Just as Thomas turned around to return to the boat, he heard strange noises coming from the airplane. It sounded like someone was knocking on the window. "That's not possible," Thomas whispered to himself. Could the missing archaeologist still be alive? Thomas swam to the boat as fast as he could. He needed to go back as soon as possible. What if the archaeologist was still alive? Thomas needed to save him, but he had no spare tank with him. He has to go back to town, get new gear, and figure out what's happening. While Thomas sails towards the nearest town, he sees bad weather coming his way. The clouds got darker, the rain started falling, and the currents were getting stronger. A storm is coming. Thomas needs to get back to the mainland before it's too late. Thomas was stressing out. He had never experienced anything like this before. The waves got higher and higher, making it almost impossible for him to control the boat. Thomas is in the eye of the storm. He has never seen anything like this before. An enormous wave hit the boat, capsizing and instantly sinking it. Thomas got pulled into the depths. He tries to swim back to the surface as fast as he can. The boat was completely destroyed. A few floating pieces were all that were left. Thomas swam to one of the pieces and held on for dear life. Thomas holds on to the piece of wood as tightly as possible as he sees the remainder of his boat sink to the bottom of the ocean. With no end in sight, Thomas becomes more and more desperate. Thomas is exhausted. He doesn't have the strength to swim anymore. He had been out on these waters for hours now. He climbs onto the floating piece he has been holding and decides to close his eyes for just a minute. Thomas wakes up from a wave crashing in his face. When he opens his eyes, he sees blue skies, and he hears voices inside his head. Is Thomas still alive? Thomas wasn't dead. The two fishermen who saw him were shocked when they saw him floating in the sea. They carried him onto their boat and brought him to their village. Thomas could be in real danger here. He had never seen this village before. He was nowhere near the place he was supposed to be. How was he ever going to find the needed gear and help to get back to the sunken airplane? Thomas was exhausted. He needed to find a place where he could freshen up, eat something, sleep, and get back to the airplane as soon as possible. He needs to know what was inside the airplane. But how on earth will he ever get back without a boat or gear? Thomas walked through the entire village, searching for a hotel. The village people looked weird at Thomas. They looked at him like they didn't want him to be there. Somehow they knew something was up with him, but soon he would prove them all wrong. He almost gave up hope, but then something unexpected happened. Finding a place to stay didn't go without trouble. Everybody closed their doors when they saw Thomas walking down the street. It was obvious that nobody wanted him here. He finally found a bar that let him in and even offered him a key to a room so he would have a place to sleep. They even offered him food and drinks. But of course, not for free. They wanted something in return. They wanted answers. People heard rumors about Thomas's finding. They heard that he had found a hidden treasure while he was out in the ocean. The village people thought Thomas was a rich man and that he was carrying the found treasure with him. Thomas had no choice but to tell the truth. And so he told them the story of his expedition. But when Thomas told his story, nobody believed what he said. They thought he was some delusional freak, so they left. But there was one mysterious person left in the room. All night long, a guy was sitting in the corner of the room, out of sight. He was talking to himself, and his head was twitching every now and then. When everybody left, the guy came to Thomas. "What do you want from me?" Thomas shouted, agitated. The guy introduced himself. "Hi, Thomas. My name is Andy, also known as the Town's Freak. I overheard your story about the sunken airplane." It was said Andy told and believed urban legends. This was no exception. "Let me tell you one thing. I am not crazy, and neither are you." Andy told the story of a treasure hunter who stole from a temple. It was rumored that the person who stole the treasures from this temple would be cursed. Although he allegedly succeeded in obtaining the treasure, he was never seen again. Maybe this could be him. Thomas, skeptical as he was, didn't believe a word Andy said. However, Andy did offer his help to investigate the sunken airplane. Thomas needed some help to clarify more about this mysterious airplane, so Thomas acted like he believed the urban legend. After a few drinks, Andy left, and they agreed to meet the next morning and return to the sunken plane. Since Thomas still believed Andy to be a weird guy, he wondered whether he would ever see Andy again. Andy would, however, remain with Thomas until the issue was cleared up. Thomas had trouble falling asleep because he kept thinking about what he had seen that day. It was a haunting image and the most bizarre thing he had ever seen. Due to the fractures in the airplane's window, he was still unsure if he had seen it correctly. However, Andy's story matched what Thomas had seen that day. Could the story be true? Thomas thought. Thomas just couldn't take it anymore and decided to search for answers. He went to the local library in the middle of the night, hoping to find something there. If Andy is telling the truth, something must be written about it, right? Thomas thought out loud. When Thomas left his room, he sensed footsteps behind him. He didn't think much about it at first, but when he went outside, he could still hear someone following him. Thomas was freaking out. Was he just being paranoid, or were his instincts right? Thomas was afraid to look back, but he still heard footsteps behind him. When Thomas caught a glimpse of what was behind him, he ran as quickly as possible. He ran into every possible alley and was finally able to shake off his stalker. Thomas arrived at the library searching for the right book. After searching for almost an hour, he finally found something. It was an old, torn-up, dusty book. He already noticed that some of the pages were torn up. Thomas wasn't the first one who tried to solve this mystery. After flipping through hundreds of pages, he found an image that confirmed Andy's crazy story. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. Andy was right, after all. What Thomas saw in that image confirmed everything he thought and saw that day. This will change everything. Thomas attempts to tear some of the pages, but while he does so, he notices a shady man in the library's corner. Could this be the same guy that was following him? When Thomas was running away from his stalker, he couldn't tell who this man was, but his gut told him that that was his stalker. Out of fear, Thomas instantly ran away, but when he turned around, there was already someone standing behind him. Thomas has never been this scared in his life. Thomas felt like this was his end. He needed to confess everything. He had never experienced this kind of situation before, and he had never been good at lying, so Thomas had no choice but to confess his plans. But then, with all the luck in the world, something happened that would change everything. "Hey, Thomas, right? I was wondering if you could help me with something. I can't reach the shelf of the book you're holding. Can you put it back when you're done reading it?" Fortunately, it was the library work. A relief came off Thomas's shoulder, but he still wanted to leave the library as fast as possible. He went back to the hotel and went straight into bed. When Thomas woke up in the morning, he was eager to find out what was inside the airplane. But when he turned around, he got the shock of his life. Andy was sitting next to Thomas's bed, waiting for him to wake up. "What the hell are you doing, Andy?" Thomas found it very strange that Andy was suddenly sitting beside his bed. "What are you doing here?" Thomas shouted at Andy. Andy was silent for a minute, got up and walked away. "I wonder why they call you the town freak," Thomas said. Eventually, Thomas and Andy met again in the hotel lobby. Without talking about what had happened earlier, they made their way to the boat rental company. Thomas kept a close eye on Andy because he was no longer sure if he could trust him. The longer they were together, the more suspicious Thomas got of Andy. Andy was just this weird guy, acting strange, talking to the voices in his head and arguing with himself. Maybe it was a bad idea to take Andy with him, but Thomas knew that sending Andy away was pointless. It was quite a hard spot to find since Thomas didn't remember the exact coordinates and everything was lost during the capsizing of his boat. But after almost an hour, they finally arrived at the spot. Now they would finally get to know what's exactly hidden in that airplane. Thomas and Andy got ready to dive into the water. They brought some gear with them that would help to break the window. Thomas prepared himself well. He didn't want to return with empty hands. This time, preparation was key. Thomas and Andy dove down, and Thomas noticed they were getting closer. It was quite deep, and after about 20 meters underwater, they saw the plane from a distance. Thomas immediately sprang into action when they arrived at the plane and smashed the window. Both Thomas and Andy couldn't believe their eyes when they saw what was inside. They broke down in tears, and Thomas was shocked that Andy had been telling the truth all along. Maybe he wasn't as crazy as Thomas thought after all. This discovery was amazing. They decided to bring it back to the surface for further inspection. It was heavier than they thought, so it took quite some time to bring it back to the boat, but after some hard work, they succeeded. Now they could finally get closer to the treasure they had found. At first glance, it looked like some kind of mummy, but they both knew it was not just that. There was another secret hidden inside this mummy. They opened it up and found a magnificent diamond. It must be worth millions of dollars, they thought. Months later, they arranged an auction to sell the archaeological treasure of the century. They told the story of the treasure hunter, and the curse was said to be on the stolen treasure. The sale price was sky high, and the diamond sold for $54 million. Thomas and Andy never have to worry about money again.